I want to take advantage of the kind of opportunities that are on YouTube in terms of like educational content. With this, I'm basically planning on doing a Get Faster series where I'm just going to go into loads of detail about sort of my coaching process for how I get athletes to get the results that they want. I'll sort of draw on my experience, GB team, my 10 years rowing experience, as well as my kind of like equal to that, my coaching experience. But basically what I'm going to be covering is literally every single part of getting faster that I can think of. I'm always looking for new areas to work on. How detailed can I be is kind of like my approach to it. In this series, I'm going to dig into that, document it, go into some explanations, and hopefully you find some value from it. I'll be looking at the macro plan, specifics, scheduling, analysis as well, trying to figure out what sort of sessions are best for certain athletes, when to plot them in, some sort of technical work as well on the rowing machine, in the boat, in the gym as well. Look at recovery as well, how to know when you maybe need recovery periods, how to know you may be under recovering, and maybe how to identify if you're maybe just fatigued and in a period where you need to press on. Talk a lot about mindset and motivation. I'll look at weights programming, and along with that, injury prevention, which again for me is the number one priority when it comes to weights training. And then lastly, probably the least popular, that often gets the least amount of engagement, but for me as a coach, I view as by far the most important, and that's mindset. So first part of the Get Faster series, it's kind of, I'm gonna kind of roughly sort of walk you through my process when I bring on a new athlete. You know, obviously as it's not specific to one person, I can't get very specific on how I actually do it. So I'll try and give you sort of a general approach to it so you can get an idea, maybe give you some ideas to go run away with. So the first part is always, the first thing I do when I bring someone on is look at the fixed dates that we know of. So look at work schedule and look at when we know there's going to be busy periods in work, look at when there's going to be holidays, look at when we maybe know there's going to be a higher stress period and a lower stress period, and then plot these into the long-term planner. Again, I'll show you in a second. And then of course, most importantly, for those that are looking for performance and know which dates those are going to be, plot those into the long-term planner. And then once we've kind of got all those fixed dates, is what I call them, work around those, figure out what's going to fit best for the athlete. So this is kind of a rough idea of how I sort of plan things out when I bring on a new athlete. So of course this is, you know, a bit backdated, but basically this is sort of the raw template where I start with anybody and I work backwards. So I think, for example, what we might do in this circumstance is plot in. So the first things I kind of talk about are holidays, busy work periods, and then the events that we know we want to be peaking for. Those are kind of the roughly. Again, there's kind of the more vague sort of like, this is a busier period at school or at work, or this is a lower stress period. Again, it's a bit harder to plan that. That's kind of more of a communication sort of thing. But for me, those are the kind of first things we plot in. So just for example, I think we can maybe do the world champs. So if we know the World Rowing Indoor Championships, we can plot that in there. And then, okay, we can use Christmas as an example. If you know you're not going to be training, so you're training, you're going on a skiing holiday, that's another thing to consider as well, as like what sort of holiday are you going on? Are you skiing on a beach? Are you skiing on a beach? Are you skiing on the slopes, or are you doing a busy backpacking holiday, or are you gonna go and sit on a beach for a week? But anyways, that would maybe be, we plot in a holiday here, and maybe a holiday there. So again, depending on what sort of holiday you're in as well, that's going to affect what sort of training you do around that. But what we know, again, I'm going to indicate the load here, just with a basic light, medium, or heavy. Of course, you might be aware, generally the science shows that the best way to prepare for an event is from 10 days out to start tapering volume and keep a small amount of intensity in. So that will be the first thing we do. We basically indicate light, so that's a light week. Now again, what I've found is that it's not always as simple as that. That's the sort of general approach, but figuring out a tapering strategy that works best for you is important, and you kind of have to play around with it. Figure out in training, like when when do you feel your best? Is it 3 days after a heavy week? Is it 10 days? Is it after maybe like you've had an illness and you've come back feeling the strongest you've ever felt? Maybe you need a very low volume, low intensity rest period to taper. So yeah, basically that is the kind of first things I plot in. Now, of course, on the holiday, we plot those in as light weeks unless you have access to a gym. And now kind of the last point to look at is maybe, now again, this is just an example, but say we've got a work trip and it's travel. So you're going to be traveling from the 10th of November to the 13th. Now again, it's important to note what sort of travel is this? Are you going from Glasgow down to London and you have access to a gym, or are you flying 12 hours across the world and you're changing time zones completely? Again, that's going to affect the sort of balance that we have here. But for this case, I'm just going to say it's kind of average travel. Maybe you're traveling for a few hours, not too much of a a change in time zones, and it's one that's not going to disrupt our training too much. So generally, if we know that a holiday is going to be a rest period, what I will do is plot in a heavy week before that and generally a heavy week after that. If you get that balance right, you can actually recover on the holiday, and it's something that can get you faster. Now on the other side, depending on what sort of travel you're doing, if you're changing time zones, if you're going through a lot of fatigue, while it might actually be harder for you to get in training while you're away, you might think that that's going to be a rest point, but you also have to account for the fatigue. Maybe you're going into a higher stress period at work. Maybe, and as I said before, maybe you're changing time zones massively and your circadian rhythm is going to be ruined. At that point, you wouldn't want to be putting a heavy volume before and a heavy volume afterwards. The training that you would be doing in that week probably wouldn't be very beneficial because you'd be so fatigued and you'd just be setting yourself back for when you came back and got back into your routine. So it's important to know when to push and when to back off. So if we know that this is just going to be a fairly chilled out travel period for work, then we can put this as a heavy week for the run into when we're going to be heading away on the 10th. Now from here, getting into the specifics. Generally, you don't want to push too hard sort of the second week out, so we might class that as a medium. Now again, as I always say, it depends on the individual. You might find that you coming in really, really hot, like out of a high volume phase, and then pulling right back is what works best for you. But again, I'm just trying to give you a general approach, give you some education, some value that you can go away and try on your own. Now from there, generally 2, 3, 4 weeks out is when you want to have quite a good combination of volume and intensity. So we're going to write in some heavy weeks here. Now that's the other important part as well. Some people respond really well to 2 or 3 heavy weeks in a row. Some people respond to having far more rest than that, and you need to analyze your data, pay attention to your recovery, know that if you're in a high fatigue state in a heavy week, is that what you want? If you're in a high fatigue state when you're getting to the end of a recovery block and you're still not bouncing back, then that's a sign that you've probably pushed too hard. You might need to extend the light week. You might need to recover some more. So again, it's all very much a learning process of like how far can you toe the line? How far can you push it without overdoing it, without overtraining? Now again, generally for a heavy block, I would rarely do more than 4 weeks in a row. So just to give you an example of my thoughts here is that looking back, if we knew we wanted 2 heavy weeks, now depending on the individual, this might just be 1 heavy week, it might be 2, it might be 3, but in this case we're just going to use 2. How do we want to build into that? Do we want to go into it rested, or do we want to be kind of building gradually over time? Do we want to be coming in very low and then going up high for a high amount of time, or do we want to kind of gradually increase the mileage? Again, in this case, I'm just going to say medium. Now you can also sort of look back. So once you kind of get a couple weeks back from your race, you've kind of got some of the information up here, and then you start going back, you can kind of like piece together some of the weeks around your holidays and around your work period. So again, we're coming out of a holiday. Now, depending on how well you respond to training, if you're a good responder to high volume, then you might be able to jump straight back into heavy training. But if you're somebody that you may maybe a bit less experienced, you've not got as much mileage under your belt, you might want to make this a medium week. Again, in this case, we're just going to say that we're going to go for a heavy block. And then at the same time before as well, as we're using this holiday as a recovery period, we want to make sure that we're heavy before that as well. Now, for this example, again, I wish I could go into more specifics, but we just have to stick with the sort of template that we have here. 2-week block is a good amount of rest. So we probably would want to be pushing quite hard before that. So we might do a heavy block before that as well. So 2 weeks heavy going in. And again, depending on who you are, I'll keep repeating this. You might want 3 heavy weeks. You might want 1. You might want 2 mediums and a heavy. What we do know generally is that you don't want to be coming in light before you go on holiday. So again, working back from that, maybe go medium again. And again, now we can start kind of use, okay, we've pieced back a couple blocks from our holiday. We can look back even further now. So we've got travel. Again, if this is a general period, then we might be able to just hop back into this. So if this was a general sort of travel day, we might be able to hop back into a medium week. If we're changing time zones massively, so probably going to want it to be a light week. Again, if you're responding well, if you're adapted to the training, this sort of period when you're maybe like 8-10 weeks out, you kind of want to be cranking the volume pretty hard, in which case we'd go for a heavy week. Again, trying to think of sort of like a general approach that is going to be able to give everybody an idea. For this case, we'll just call this a medium week. Now again, we can see we've only got sort of 1 more week to plot in here. How at this stage you might want to be thinking, how recovered am I? Am I ready? You know, you get an idea looking ahead, okay, you might be starting to like feel it a little bit, and you're looking ahead, okay, nearly end of November, I've only got, I've got a medium and 2 heavy weeks, something that's going to be quite highly demanding. Am I in a position that I'm going to be able to push through that? But at the same time, look and know that you've got a 2-week recovery period after it. Is it something you're going to be able to recover for? Are you going to hold back and rest? Again, and this is kind of like the process that I go go through where I'm looking at the athlete, starting to know them, building a relationship with them, kind of knowing how they respond to these things and like what sort of motivates them as well. So now maybe we've learned, okay, the athlete needs a bit more rest. We maybe put that in as a light week. And then if we know, okay, right, we're coming out of travel, we can maybe adapt this. Maybe we don't need a medium week after our travel period. We can go back into a heavy one. Okay, and now you just want to start plotting in these weeks like this. Now you can see there's much less space to fill in. Again, you can kind of repeat this process that I've done here for further back if you're like maybe a few months out from a race. One thing that's probably worth noting as well, after, say, just for the example, the World Indoors, after this race, what's next? Generally, you don't want to taper more than once every 8 weeks. Ideally more than that, 12 weeks, kind of 16 weeks is what you want. Interrupted training, you can of course incorporate testing into your programming. It's a great way to sort of get an idea of data and where you're at. But at the same time, you don't want to be tapering for every single test you get because it's just going to be interrupting your training. Again, generally, if we know that we've not got our next race coming up, then pretty much always after a sort of race, especially after a big build up like this, definitely a light week. It might be a case of taking a few days off. It might just be if people like to keep moving, keep training, just super, super low volume, super low intensity. A proper recovery week is low volume and low intensity. A taper week is low volume with some intensity. Now again, okay, now we've got a good picture of here, looking at these light weeks. We've just come out of, we're trying to fill in these last 2 blocks here. We've just had 2 weeks rest and then a heavy block. Chances are you're going to be able to push for another heavy block here. Okay, and then for me, this would be a case of, again, looking at the layout. To go heavy again, you're gonna need to be a pretty high responder to heavy training blocks if you're able to do another heavy week. So for me, this case would definitely be a medium. It would definitely be either a medium or a light. And for this case, just to kind of make the colors look a bit prettier, let's go for a light week. Again, I would never use that as an actual sort of thought process, but just to kind of give you some ideas. Yeah, hope that was helpful. Again, this is the sort of like first step when I bring somebody on. It's the first kind of thing. If you have the luxury of knowing like you've got 12 weeks of training, if you've got 24 weeks of training, you can kind of sit down and look at the year ahead and plan that out. You basically want to punch in fixed dates when you know you have to be somewhere, when you know you have to be performing, when you have to know you're working, or if you've got a holiday. Plot those in and then figure out what's going to work best for you. Time those heavy weeks around when you're going to be rested and just try and get that balance right so that you can, of course, enjoy your life, still perform in your work or maybe your education as well at the same time, but then at the same time get the results that you want. So this will kind of be the style that I do these Get Faster series in. Kind of a general approach, kind of walking through how I would bring on the average athlete and get them the results that they want. So the kind of next part to this is going to be sort of maybe like more the weekly breakdown, looking at how to figure out what your schedule is going to be, when to put which sessions where.